folks. Welcome back to the Podcast Digest. My name is Dan Lizette, and thank you again for taking the time to join me. I got a great show and conversation for you, but I just wanted to mention first quickly before we jump into this week's show, I really hope that you all had a chance to listen to and enjoyed my interview last week with Mignon Fogarty from Grammar Girl. If you're just hopping in on this episode, it's awesome. Thanks. But I strongly urge you to go back and check that one out. Mignon had some unbelievable stories from her decade plus in podcasting, and I think you'll really find it pretty interesting. And if you did hear it and enjoy it, take a moment, pop open iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, whatever you're listening to me on right now. Leave a quick review. It's super fast, easy to do, and it's the easiest way to help make sure that more people find out about the Podcast Digest and all the great conversations I'm very happy to have. So really appreciate it, folks. So now let's talk about this week's show and this week's guest. My guest this week for episode 106 is a reporter with WXXI in Rochester, New York, who earlier this summer wrapped up an excellent podcast that I really am excited to tell you guys about. The show is called Finding Tammy Jo, and I'm very honored to be joined by co-host Veronica Volk. Hi, Veronica.
Hey, Dan. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thanks for joining me. And I think you reached out to me earlier this summer and let me know about this new show coming up, and I added it to my queue and was immediately hooked and waiting for every new episode as it came out. But before we jump into the show, and we're going to talk all about it and let everybody know about it, I'd like folks to get to know at least one half of the show, and we'll talk about your co-host as well. So can you tell folks a little bit, before Finding Tammy Jo became a thing, what is sort of your background, your early life, if you will?
My early life. Okay. Well, I was born and raised on the Jersey Shore, and I kind of kicked around for a little while, jobs, community college, that kind of thing. Kind of classic, like I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life, I guess, but I always knew I wanted to. You know, I liked writing, I liked telling stories, I liked talking to people and learning things. I ended up somehow studying nursing in community college for a brief time. That didn't work out. And I guess I found myself at Fordham University in about 2011. I was 21 years old, and I was living in like my first big girl apartment. So I was totally broke. I had no money. I didn't have cable or anything like that. So my roommate at the time turned me on to WNYC, which I don't know if you've heard of it. Public radio station in New York City. So I started listening to that for basically like mostly news at first, just to kind of stay informed. And then I got turned on to their programming. And like I have this really specific memory of standing in my kitchen listening to an episode of Radio Lab called The Good Show. And I won't give away like any spoilers, but there's this really climactic moment in like the first segment of the show. And I'm sitting in my kitchen like cooking ramen or something, college. I have like a pot in one hand and like a spoon in the other, and I'm just like frozen over my stove while me and my roommate are like transfixed listening to our laptops at the time. And I just couldn't move because I was just, I was completely immersed in this story, and I was like transfixed and transported, and it was, that show was so beautifully produced, and I was like, I want to do that. Like that's the thing that I didn't even know that I wanted until I just heard this. So yeah, luckily Fordham has this totally amazing public radio station right in the basement, and I went down there and just like kind of applied for an internship out of nowhere. And in the news department down there, they just like throw you right in. So I'm like in my first month as a so-called reporter, and I'm in the Blue Room in New York City, like rubbing elbows with New York Times reporters and like covering de Blasio at the time. And I was just like completely hooked like into the journalism scene. And it was so exciting and like so fast paced. And I got to tell all these really cool stories. And then like I kind of moved through that place a little bit. I was at one point the senior producer of their like public affairs, but also arts and culture show, which was really fun. I really just loved working with the audio editing software. I found it like kind of magical that I could take all these sounds and like weave them together and add music. And then there was like natural sound, and I could write scripts, and it was just like totally great. And then after that, I needed to find like a different job because I was part-time there and I was in college. And luckily my old news director, knew my now news director And so I found myself up in Rochester, and I've been kind of here ever since. That was in, I guess, December of 2014. So, yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
That's my origin story.
Yeah, there you go. And I can totally appreciate the concept of Radiolab. I mean, that is, what's amazing is it's sort of one of the OG shows in the podcasting world, but they continually put out just amazing things. And I've always said they have their own style. Like, even if you didn't hear like the intro or the outro and just listen to it and even change the voices, like you said, the production aspect to it is so Radiolab to me. And that's amazing because a lot of people tried to emulate it and nobody does it better as far as I'm concerned.
Absolutely not. No. And I was just thinking about this the other day, listening to a Radiolab show. They have so many like little elements that make it so amazing. Like it's not just the music and the composition, of course, like that's what everyone thinks about, but they have these breaks between segments where they'll just play music or like tones, and it gives you this moment to like absorb this super powerful story that you just heard. And it's just like such an interesting idea and so perfect for that show. But
I think the one thing for me, as we nerd out on Radiolab at this point, the one thing that has always gotten to me about it, which is amazing, is the interwoven interviews. And what I mean by that is that you will get sort of narration that's not a restatement of the question, but could almost restate the answer and then cut back to the guest for their statement, then cut back to a rephrased question. And it's like this nice, crisp, clean presentation of a conversation that's so much better than what I'm going to be putting out with this show. Basically, you know what I mean? It's amazing.
I want to peek behind that curtain. Like, how many interviews are they doing to get all of that? Like, that's the thing that kind of, I don't know, excites me about this.
Absolutely. It's very stylized and I love it, and it's amazing. So, but anyway, so you ended up in Western New York. Is that when you joined WXXI?
Yeah, I was, I started out here as like a general assignment reporter, walked into a completely podcastless environment, which, I kind of like bounced around looking for, my beat, what's my niche. And I'm the token millennial, I guess you could say, of our newsroom. So, there's a lot of, things that I experiment with in terms of like new media and digital media. And I think it might have been a little bit of an inevitability that I would at least try to make something like Finding Tammy Jo, like a podcast, a narrative, nonfiction kind of thing.
So how did this come up? Other than the idea that you were a huge podcast fan and might want to try one yourself, how did sort of this idea, this story, and the partnership, and I want to bring him in because I know he's a big part with Gary Craig from Democrat and Chronicle, how did this all come to be?
Okay. Long story, but, that's what this is for, right?
Yeah, exactly. I love the long stories.
Okay, so like I said, I was general assignment reporter, and at one point I went to a press conference in Livingston County, and it turned out to be the press conference that's at the end of the season where they have identified this girl who was a murder victim in the 1970s. Finally, they've identified her, and this was in January of 2015, I want to say. And I remember going to that press conference and talking to the police officers there and being super intrigued with the story and wanting to find out more about the girl, not just Tammy Jo Alexander and the life that she had led, but also this community of people who had been so obsessed with the case for so long, even if they didn't have a name for her or an identity for her. From there, it was kind of like always in the back of my mind. They would do updates constantly, offer rewards for more information. There were follow-up press conferences, that kind of thing. And it was always in the back of my mind. But it wasn't until Gary and I were on a panel together about kind of like the future of journalism, which is something that a lot of people in the industry like to talk about. Like, what are we going to do, with ourselves as people move into like this uncertain digital future, right? And we got talking about podcasting on that panel, and we kind of decided that we both wanted to do a show together. By the way, just as a side note, we went about this totally the wrong way, because everyone says when you make a podcast, like, pick a story that you want to tell first. It's more about the story than it is about the medium. But for us, it was totally about the medium. Like, we wanted to create this like different way of experiencing like a story, and at least for our market, right? So this story made the most sense for the podcasting medium because you have so many different voices coming together to like tell this like oral history of like what happened. And it just seemed to fit together really well. And I had always been, really inspired by Gary's work. He is fantastic. He's like just crazy old school print reporter, like crime beat. He's so connected to like everyone in law enforcement. He's just like totally fantastic at what he does. So selfishly, the opportunity to work with him just as a colleague and a mentor was so appealing to me. And it turned out to be I just think like a really great partnership in terms of what we both brought to the table. So that was, after we had that panel discussion, we kind of kicked around the idea of doing Finding Tammy Jo, which didn't have a name until like maybe 2 weeks before we launched it. But yeah, it was from then it was kind of a long process of convincing our organizations to work together on this.
And that was exactly my next question, because I don't know if you've heard this. You mentioned to me before we hit record that you have heard my show before, but back on episode 92, I spoke to two people that it sounds like such a similar story in the sense that Amy Westervelt and Julia Ritchie from a show called Range out in the West wanted to do a podcast as well, and they were a part of, I believe it's Nevada Public Radio. But they couldn't convince their sort of daytime employer to back it. So they did it on their own, and they still are to this day, as far as I know, producing Range of their own passion and their own research and their own time, so to speak. Now they get like after hours access to a studio, but that's about it. And so because they had trouble, if you will, kind of bringing those old school organizations up to 2015, 2016, worthy, enterprises to touch a new audience. What was that process like for the two of you?
It was challenging. I mean, obviously ultimately rewarding, but, and just to give you like kind of a sense of like the media landscape here in Rochester, it's like, we're like a mid-sized market, and I get the impression that a lot of the organizations see each other as being in competition with each other. And I kind of wanted to break that down a little bit, because I think that especially when you talk about a medium like podcasting, we're in competition with everybody. We're not in competition with each other. We're in competition with the rest of the internet and the rest of the world that has access to this technology. So the way that Gary and I pitched it was kind of like, here's this story that we want to tell, and we have all these resources to tell it, but we're a package deal. Like Gary brought with him like years of crime reporting experience. I brought with me the audio production, and we kind of pulled for each other in that way. And it took months of like planning meetings. There's all that behind the scenes kind of stuff. And there were times when I thought maybe this would be easier if we just did it ourselves. But ultimately, I think the fact that we had our organizations behind us, and it required a lot of trust on their part. They did trust our vision for this, and they trusted a lot of our ideas for this. We basically like threw every idea we had at like storytelling into this project. I think it paid off. And it's also, there's something to be said for having the reach of an organization. Like, for instance, the Democrat and Chronicle, they have like a huge social reach, which, is something that you maybe don't want to talk about. It sounds like a little bit like, I don't know, markety or like brand speak or whatever, but you want to reach those people ultimately. If you make a thing that you're proud of, you want other people to hear it. And I thought that maybe my self-promoting it might not have gotten us as far also. So.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I always estimate about half my audience is probably other podcasters, and I think we all can appreciate the concept of any type of platform, any type of inbuilt audience for reception, especially the nature of what you guys were doing. Not only sort of, correct me if I'm wrong, it was each organization's first first try at a podcast. Yes. Yeah.
Well, okay. So if you want to get into like what's the weedsy definition of a podcast, because technically, like, I feel like public radio has moved in and kind of taken ownership over the podcasting space by digitizing a lot of like previously more ephemeral shows. So we have shows that we've released as podcasts, but this was our first like digital first.
Right.
This is going to live on a website. And even I think the DNC has had podcasts before. But they're interview-based podcasts, and they weren't as well produced. They didn't have studios at the time that could like support, the recording and that kind of stuff.
Gotcha.
But so there were podcasts in their own particular way, I guess. But this was the first thing that we branded as like, this is our podcast department, and this is what we can do with it.
Right. It was created initially for podcast delivery. Primarily.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Well, I have a ton of questions on the production process, and we'll go through a few of the episodes and do our best not to give away too much. But before we do, and I wanted to bring this up, you touched a little bit on it, and maybe this is really a big place, I'm assuming, where your partnership with Gary, you probably leaned on heavily. From what I gather, throughout these, and folks, this is an 8-episode run, okay? And with the exception of the 8th one, which I also want to talk about, they're very short, easily consumable episodes. So make sure you're going through the links in the show notes and subscribing to this thing, because it's not a heavy lift. You will go through it all very quickly and just be wanting more. But imagine what you found probably very quickly, and maybe even in that initial news conference in January of 2015, was how involved the community was in this, and how touched by this story, this experience of 3+ decades that was interwound into the people in the community. Did that carry like its own weight with it, or was there like this sense of doing the story a certain amount of justice or responsibility because it seemed to be so ingrained locally?
That absolutely like carried its own weight. I mean, like, there was something about this particular case and this particular girl that people latched onto. And it was immediately apparent to me when I went to that first news conference, but even more so a few months later, the Livingston County Sheriff's Office put together a memorial service for her where they rededicated like her tombstone. And it was completely populated by people who never knew this girl, like when she was alive. They lived in the town where she was found, or they lived in the town or they knew a woman who was working at the hospital the night she came in for, an autopsy, or they were neighbors with the sheriff. These are all people that have stayed connected to this for, I think it's like 37 years now, 36 years. And after knowing nothing about this girl while she was alive. And I wanted to get to what it was about this case and what it was about her that inspired that kind of following, which is something that I try to do throughout the course of the story.
Did you assume, and I know you alluded to this in the early episodes, was your initial assumption just that this is not the area of a state or country where you typically would see this type of crime? That this was a pretty shocking experience for this area?
That played into it heavily, too. And we spoke with Jim Redmond, who was a reporter at the time, and he says specifically in his interview with Gary and I that, this was Livingston County, which is a really rural Western New York place. And, she was found in a cornfield, by a farmer and his son, and it was just like so shocking and so tragic and so out of character. And I think that when you experience that kind of story in your own backyard, it kind of like breaks the narrative of what you think, like where you think you live and kind of the story of that place. And for that reason, it sticks out in your mind like so completely. So yeah.
Yeah, and it comes through in the first few episodes. And I want to tell a quick story. I alluded to this with you again before we hit record. This is probably my first time in 106 episodes of the Podcast Digest that I actually have a little small bit of info that I can contribute to this story that we're talking about, folks.
I'm really excited to hear this now.
So I'm originally from New York, upstate New York, not Western. But when I lived in Virginia Beach for a long time, I had a friend who spent all of her childhood growing up in Western New York. In fact, she was only in Virginia for a few years, since relocated, currently lives in Dansville.
Get
New York.
out of here.
I'm not even joking. In fact, when I first started listening to Finding Tammy Jo and blew through it, as I'm suggesting that you do, folks, I was telling myself all the time, I need to let my friend know, hey, have you heard about this show? Have you heard about this story? And for some reason, it was right before Podcast Movement, completely slipped my mind and what happened. Then when we went to arrange our conversation today, Veronica, I was reminded again, and just today, I shot it off to my friend in New York, and I say, hey, have you ever heard of this? And she's like, oh my God. She's like, not only have I heard about it, she's like, I've known about it since I was a kid. In fact, she says that before that January 15 unveiling of her identity in that news conference, that there was an article in the local paper that talked about her previous grave that was labeled, and you guys have pictures of this on the website with the lest we forget the unknown girl, that type of thing, that at the time, before that was removed, there was a statement in the article of the local paper about how it appears as if somebody had been putting fresh mulch around it and little angel caricatures and all this other stuff. That was my friend's mother, who was going to that grave and taking care of it. In fact, my friend tells me that her and her brother growing up were aware of this girl, and them as a family had visited the grave repeatedly, and they'd even given her her own name, Molly. And so in the family, they would refer to her as Molly growing up.
Wow. Dan, there are so many stories like that. There are so many of those people.
Yeah,
it's crazy.
I couldn't believe it when and it just speaks to how consumed the area was with this type of story and what happened and how, like you said, how involved everyone is. It's amazing.
That is so crazy that you have a friend from
Isn't it
Dansville.
amazing? And she says
with
that
such a personal connection.
She was going to actually send me a picture of the local news clipping where from January 15 with the name that her mother had put on her fridge and still there to this day.
Wow. Wow.
I couldn't
Talk
believe
about
it.
being connected to it, though.
I'm telling you. And I never even made the connection till, and this comes up in later episodes, you guys talk about where Tammy Jo is buried, and that she's still there to this day. And that was a point of conversation in one of the episodes. And so that made me think, hey, I need to ask her about this.
Wow.
Oh, yeah. So that was my little news about that.
I'm so glad you told me that. Honestly, like maybe I just come from a more jaded part of the world, but like I hear that story and I hear stories like that, and maybe, I'm more of a product of our time or something, but I can't identify in the same way with any particular news story or person or any sort of like tragic incident like that. And so it's stories like that got me thinking, and the story, of course, of Sheriff John York and his kind of tireless efforts in this, that got me thinking like this, there's something here. There's something about her that really gets to people. And I really want to tell that part of the story. Yeah,
and I wanted to talk about Sheriff York because his representation in the podcast, the way he speaks, and I mentioned this a minute ago, folks, but definitely go out and check the link in the website for Finding Tammy Jo, hosted with the Democrat and Chronicle. They've got all kinds of stuff on there, videos and maps and all this stuff. In this really unique clip from, I believe, was it Unsolved Mysteries?
America's Most
Wanted. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
One of those 90s crime shows
right.
where Sheriff York was going through and talking about all these years later about it still being unsolved. And you can just see the passionate involvement. How quickly in the process or how did it really impact you once you started to talk with him that all these years later he was still so consumed with trying to find out what happened?
Well, individually, the press conference that I went to in January of 2015, he gets up and he says, he said a line that I'll never forget, where he said, "It's a great day to give her a name," which was like stuck in my craw for so long. And the first interview that Gary and I did with him, and I say first because there were more than one, I want to say it was like an hour and 40 minutes long, where we sat and talked. And like you said, the podcast is not long. It comes in like 10 to 15 minute segments. But we spoke with him for like almost 2 hours, and kind of he's such an interesting character because he'll kind of move from his cop persona where he's going through the facts. It's just like, cold hard truth, this, and this. And then you'll ask him a question that touches him in this certain way, and he becomes like this emotional person when he's talking about, this girl. And he's so passionate about this and so dogged about this. That interview really like kind of showed me really into his mindset about this, which is she didn't deserve to die this way, and therefore we are going to solve this. And he's just such an awesome old school sheriff. Like, he's just such a great interview.
I mean, clearly, again, that's just built into the way somebody's wired, right? The way he was raised, the way he is as a person, so on and so forth. But again, I kind of come back to on his watch, so to speak. And I know he wasn't sheriff at the time of the murder, but that department, again, this wasn't a normal deal. And I imagine this sense of importance that this wasn't right, and we've got to get to the bottom of this, just was ingrained throughout the department, and he obviously embodied that in the best way possible.
Yeah, Investigator Brad Schneider, who's now the lead on this case, says at one point, I think it might have been during our live talk, that you don't walk through the doors of the Livingston County Sheriff's Office without knowing about this case.
Right.
And that was all Sheriff York's doing. He made sure that people knew about this and that it was on people's radar, and just in the hopes that at some point something would budge and someone would know something.
I want to jump into the production process, but before we kind of leave some of the local folks in the local experience, I want to, this question literally just popped in my mind. You were still so new to the area when you jumped into this. As you starting these interviews and starting to realize how involved this community is with this story and how it impacted so many people, did you start to feel, I don't know, more taken by where you now live, where you now work, and get this broader picture of sort of your current home?
That is such an interesting question. I'm not sure, honestly. I'm not sure if it changed the way that I think about Western New York, just because I live in such a different world than like Dansville or Caledonia. But it's definitely become part of, like, this story has definitely become part of my identity now. And whether that's a product of moving here, whether I would have thought that way about it if I hadn't entered this kind of project,
right.
I guess we won't know because I did. But
right.
But yeah, it's I guess that's the only way I can answer that.
Yeah, I guess sort of where that's coming from is I'm thinking about, Manhattan or Chicago or these type of areas where, you go to sleep at night, you wake up, there was probably 2 or 3 more murders.
Right.
And it tends to be so much more procedural. Again, I'm not, naysaying any hardworking, investigator or sheriff in those cities, but they obviously have huge full plates.
Yeah.
Obviously, the way this department handled it was much, much different than one of them. First, probably because they could, it being,
right.
A rare thing. But it also just sort of resonated, I imagine, sort of the morals and the beliefs and the way sort of they handled life in that way, as opposed to some of those other areas I'm talking about.
Yeah. That's also kind of a complicated question, too, because, living and working in Rochester, where we experience, our own kind of levels of crime and murder,
right.
Like on a much larger scale than Livingston County in 1979. The decision to focus on this particular story could in some ways be seen as like a controversial one. Like, why cover this cold case from 1979 of this young girl when there's so many more injustices happening right now that we could be talking about?
Was that feedback you guys received?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we got a ton of, feedback, negative and positive. But one of the things that Gary and I were confronted with throughout this, as we started to kind of tell people that we were telling the story, is the who cares question. Who cares? why this story? Why now? Why not, a million other murders that you could focus on, and or a million other police departments that you could talk to? And I think that criticism, has some merit, but I think that the important thing about telling a story like this and about talking to law enforcement is that you are trying to tell a more universal story and maybe kind of interrogate some broader injustices in the world. Right. One of the things that I really wanted to talk about throughout the course of the story was how complicated our system of reporting unidentified decedents is, and how connecting missing persons with, for lack of a better term, found bodies is. It's way harder than you would think it is. Like, you can find your third grade teacher on Facebook, but there are like 40, I forget the number off the top of my head, but there are thousands of unidentified people in graves without identities,
right.
And that's it. I think telling those kind of stories is important. And if the vehicle to do that is finding Tammy Jo, then I feel okay with that.
Well, yeah. And, and I think you're exactly right. I think the conclusion that you and Gary came to was it, right? Because that why this story question could be asked of any show, right? It could be asked of Serial and every other smaller show down below it. Why that particular one? Why? Because you can't cover millions of stories at once, right? You can cover a story at a time, and then, you hope that there is applicability in other areas. And using Serial as an example, we all know and understand, when you're questioning somebody's conviction, maybe that opens doors in other cases, or, season 2 with the military and all that other fun stuff, Bo Bergdahl. And, so there's obviously translation to other situations, and it's not just about focusing on one particular story. And I think you guys did a tremendous job with sort of carrying those themes over, on those topics.
Well, thank you.
So let's get into the show production itself, because you alluded to it once, and I want to jump on it right then, because clearly you didn't just go out and talk to people for 10 minutes. Talk about putting this thing together. So you guys choose this story about Tammy Jo Alexander after attending the news conference. Where do you start? Like, who do you start to talk to? What's this process like? And sort of from collecting audio to finding the narrative. Tell us what this was like.
So I want to say that it might have been like right around this time last year when we really started digging into interviews, maybe August of last year. But Sheriff York was our first interview. We brought him into the studio, and we tried to do kind of like a mix of in studio and in the field interviews, depending on like kind of place setting and where it made sense in terms of planning that production out. But we did our interviews over the course of a couple months. Some people were harder to reach than others too, because Tammy's family and friends in Florida, they didn't know us. We're just random people that came out of the woodwork after they've finally found out what happened to this girl who's been missing for so long. And now we're knocking their door down so that they can give us, 2 hours over the phone to tell us all the intimate details of their relationship with this girl. But yeah, it took probably, I want to say 6 months or so to finally do all of the interviews and start to piece the story together.
Was it until those interviews were complete that you sort of knew where this was going? Because one of the things I was wondering was, when you guys started this, what was the hope? Was the hope that you could sort of solve the thing, or was it just telling the story, or where was sort of the goal, or was it just, where's the story going to take us?
We had an idea for what we wanted the story to be, what we wanted the kind of narrative arc to be, I think. But that changes as you start to talk to people, because you can't anticipate everything that everyone's going to say. But we had a general idea of how we wanted to tell the story. But once we talked to more of Tammy's personal connections, I think we shifted a little bit into focusing more on her life and her relationships with those people. Like, the original idea was to talk a lot about how, she related to people related to her up here. And that's, in the story, and it's part of her story. But it became clear to me, at least through talking to her sister and through talking to her friend, that we really needed to do this girl justice. And in a way that like we're telling her story, not that we could solve it, because of course like you want the story to be solved and you want it to you want this story to reach as many ears as possible, because who knows, right? Like someone out there might know something and that would be fantastic. But to me, it's more about like making her a full person, making her like this fully formed person who had like thoughts and ideas and feelings, and, you know, who befell this kind of tragic end. And you mentioned Serial a minute ago, and it's really hard to escape the Serial comparison.
Right.
Which, you know, I'm totally down with, by the way, because that is like such a huge compliment. The thing I think sets Finding Tammy Jo apart from a show like Serial or like other true crime stuff like The Jinx or Making a Murderer or something like that is that those shows focus a lot on the accused. And I really wanted this to be about Tammy. And about like kind of who was this girl and what was it about her that made her so like vibrant and alive even in death.
Yeah, and I think you succeeded in that because, you know, most of those other ones that you just mentioned also have a distinct legal process that obviously has never yet occurred with Tammy Jo.
Yeah, sure.
So you guys, you know, are able to put the focus there. And when you talk about fleshing out sort of her as a person, what I noticed when listening, and I listened all the way through again today, just in preparation. I did the whole thing today, just in preparation for our conversation.
That was you.
That was me. What was interesting was that you guys seem to make a point when you say things like do her justice as a person. It came through because you guys didn't hide certain behaviors and choices that surfaced that she made, but yet those that it was almost as if you and Gary were asking yourselves, well, what would someone's reaction to this position of this person be? And going ahead and answering that question already, getting, you know, I'm thinking like her half sister to respond to different things on what they did historically. And so it was it come off to me as a very concerted effort to make sure that there was this full portrayal and it was fair.
Mm-hmm. That was really important to us because after her identification, there was a lot of finger pointing that went down because a lot of people were really confused about how a girl could go missing and not be reported missing. And there's like a whole complicated like backstory that you can hear about if you listen to the podcast. But we really didn't want to we wanted to tell the full story, of course, but we didn't want to alienate anybody, and we don't know all of the information. And I thought it was really important to say that. For instance, like Tammy's parents they're no longer alive. So there were a lot of questions that we had for them that we couldn't ask. And one of the like stylistic choices that we made was to say, like, these are the questions that we have for them that we can't ask them and therefore can't be answered. But we can ask other people in their lives, like, what do you think happened here? I think that's one of the really interesting things about podcasting is it gives you more space to have that discussion and to analyze and to weigh those kind of ideas. Whereas I think that more straight reporting leaves less room for that kind of like speculation, for lack of a better word. But we really wanted to talk about these issues and kind of flesh them out in that way. So that's why I think like podcasting worked so well for this story.
Yeah, absolutely. And with all of that as a goal in the production process and wanting to make sure that was included in the episode. And again, something you mentioned earlier, how did you cut all this stuff down to these short episodes? And was there this, I mean, clearly there was intent, right, in the length, the consumability, so on and so forth. But was it hard not to throw an hour and 40 minutes of Sheriff York out there? Because I, for one, would love to hear that raw interview.
I still have it. It's not going anywhere. I don't know what I'm going to do with it, but I still have it. Because
it would seem like there's, like you said, by telling a full story, would that not lean you to be like, hey, Gary, let's make this, 22 minutes instead of 14, because I want to make sure that, I mean, was this a constant conversation?
Yes, it was. Honestly, There are some things that I would probably change if I could go back and do it again. But because we were doing something kind of from scratch and we didn't know how people were going to respond to it, and how our organizations were going to respond to it, we wanted to make it as approachable as possible. We wanted people to be able to come to it having never listened to a podcast before and, enjoy that. And we didn't want to assume that everyone was going to be comfortable like sitting in front of a computer or a radio for like 45 minutes to an hour.
Right.
I'm totally into that, but I'm a podcast freak. So I just I was trying to like step outside of myself a little bit. And we did some research about like the average commute times in our city. And we thought about some of the ways that we could make this more shareable. And and in some ways, like those early episodes that are really short, they almost like told themselves in little bits and pieces. I don't know. I mean, like, and other choices I made, I might not have included the previouslys in every episode if I'd known people would be binging it afterwards, because we had so many listens after the whole thing had been released.
Yes.
That it was like, so it's like interesting to see the evolution of a project like that. But anyway, I digress. We wanted to keep them short. We wanted them approachable. And I think that, people had mixed feelings about that. And some of them got a little bit longer as we went on, because we wanted, maybe to take our time a little bit more. But, we were learning as we went.
And it's definitely a pro-con situation, right? It's for exactly what you said. Like when I was listening along, and I think I first hopped in on like episode 3, maybe in the timeline. So I got caught up. But then it was that situation. And I think for me, the one thing about the shorter length is, the problem is that especially when they're, a week apart or what have you, then it becomes like, oh, a whole nother week,
Right.
That becomes the feeling. It is. But on the flip side of that coin, we do live in a Netflix society nowadays. And as I mentioned already once in this conversation, Veronica, you guys are perfect. Somebody right now listening to our conversation has never heard about Finding Tammy Jo, and they're going to go subscribe to it, and they're going to boom, all of it, right now. And that's cool too, because there's not a lot of shows and series that can guarantee a listener will follow them through their full journey. And with Finding Tammy Jo, that's not a big ask of people. And so that's cool too, where you can pretty much be assured people that start out are probably going to finish. So it's a pros cons.
Yeah. No, and I'm glad that people are listening in that way too. It's really exciting.
Okay, a couple other aspects of the production for you, Veronica, and again, something I mentioned briefly earlier, but I really wanted to talk about, because today when I was doing that listen through I mentioned, I was all over the website, because I usually listen to my podcast player, right? Because it's on my phone and I'm all the time with it. Today I did it from the website, and holy mackerel, I found all this other stuff that you guys have put up there. What was the conversation around providing all this other stuff? Because most shows, mine included, don't do that. And it's great. Other videos, audios, you and Gary had a conversation over one of them at one point, different pictures, and what was that like?
Yeah, like I said early on, we wanted to take basically every idea that we had about storytelling and throw it into this project. And I have to give a huge shout out to Angie Nassar, who was one of our editors on this. She's actually, her label was officially our champion, and I could not think of like a better word for an editor as a champion. But she was really instrumental in bringing it to life in like the digital space on that website. Gorgeous website, long form. And we knew that we wanted a lot of different like multimedia elements. We wanted videos, and we had just gotten 360 cameras. So we were excited about kind of bringing people into the story in that way, in that like immersive way. And so, and all the photographs, and a lot of that too came out of the partnership, because I think while WXXI brings with it the audio expertise, the Democrat and Chronicle has a beautiful web presence, and they have kind of a lot of experience kind of putting that together. So that was really, I have to like give credit where credit is due. That was a lot of them and a lot of hard work on their part, and they were so fantastic at it. It's so great. Yeah,
it's exactly what you were saying earlier in terms of complementary components between what both your organizations brought to the table, and in these extras, it really does shine for sure.
Yeah.
One more thing about sort of the production choices and putting the show together, and you mentioned it earlier, episode 8 is a longer form, comparatively speaking for sure, live show that you guys did. Who had the idea for that? How did you think that would come together, and what was that process like?
So I have to start this answer by telling you about this theory that I have, which is that I think that in a lot of ways, like television and print and video is completely dominating the digital space. And audio has a lot of challenges reaching people on like social, right? People talk about how audio isn't shareable. It's not snackable content. It's a commitment. All the things that I love about audio make it not supposed to work. So whatever. It's long and it's slow and it's in depth. But I think that really gives an opportunity for audio to move into the physical space.
Right.
And you've seen the music industry do this for years. Live shows are huge. So I have this idea to bring, and obviously I didn't come up with this idea, but a lot of people have been creating panel discussions and live podcast tapings and kind of bringing this awesome audio storytelling into the physical space and creating these intimate connections with people. You go, for instance, like you go to a little storytelling, like you go see The Moth or something. Right. You're getting like this intimate in-person experience with something that somebody else is typically ingesting over, audio, over a podcast or something. I really wanted to create this community, and part of that was building up some live events. So the live show was one aspect of that. We also had another live event where we put together something like an exhibit of all the different photos that we had taken throughout the investigation, and some of the materials like Tammy's letters and some photographs of the evidence, that kind of thing. And we invited people in to come in and see that. And that I thought was another way to kind of like reach out to audiences and tell this story in like a different way. Just like finding all these different levels to like connect with people, because that's what I think that's what a lot of people in audio are trying to do, like reach new audiences and reach them in like this powerful and profound way.
What I find so amazing about this, Veronica, is you mentioned earlier the rather lengthy process, if you will, that sort of you and Gary had to go through to kind of convince the organizations to partner and do something like this. And obviously there was a risk in the sense of the first true digital first presentation. And you talk about, its length and all these considerations, but you guys didn't hold back. You used all the resources at your disposal to connect on all those different levels. And it just must have felt like when this timeline was all said and done, when we're only talking about a couple months ago, right?
Yeah.
What was the feeling when this was all done? There had to be a huge sense of satisfaction.
There absolutely was. And I can tell you that Gary and I, the couple months, maybe the month leading up to and the couple months as the podcast rolled out were like crazy. And, Gary and I are also both at the same time, by the way, juggling like our regular reporting schedules, like trying to keep our story
jobs,
counts up. Yeah. Day job. Right. Because that was the deal with our organizations. Like you can totally, you can do this. You guys got this. In the meantime, though, you have to continue to do all the other things that you're supposed to do.
Right.
So, we're balancing all of that and kind of putting out this podcast and planning these live events, which we wouldn't have been able to do without like an awesome team and some great resources. But we really and a lot of it is the fact that it was new. A lot of it is just the fact that we could walk in and just be like, okay, well, if you're going to let us do a podcast, why don't we also do a live taping of the podcast? And why don't we also put together an exhibit? Why don't we were like live tweeting for an hour once a week to try to like kind of field some questions about it. We experimented with like Facebook Live, just like all these different things. Like the question became like, why not do this
right.
instead of like, why do it?
So lessons learned. You mentioned once, there's a few things you do differently. But looking back on Finding Tammy Jo, sort of what do you think worked the best, and what do you think if you had to do it over, you might try differently?
I think that, well, there are a couple things like as a producer that bother me now in retrospect. We spoke to some people on cell phones. I probably would have made more of an effort to do some like ISDN or tape sync or something like that. Yeah, I mean, like, and we do the previouslys, which I loved just making as a producer. And by the way, you asked me, like, how do you go? I'd never answered this question. How did you edit all those interviews?
Yeah.
That is like I love doing that. It is my own personal form of OCD. It's going through interviews, logging tons of tape, getting like the perfect cut or like making the perfect edit is so cathartic to me. It's just like amazing. So I love doing that kind of thing. So putting like something like a previously together where you're picking out all your favorite quotes from the previous episode and like laying your favorite song from the previous episode underneath of it. I liked doing that, but it doesn't make sense. So that's probably something that I would not do again in the future.
I'll tell you what, if you have this much joy from these type of things, Veronica, there is absolutely no doubt you're in the right line of work. That's for sure. No,
I know.
Never have that worry.
I know, and I'm such like an accidental journalist too. I just like maybe fell into it a little bit, but yeah. But also lessons learned. I mean, I can't speak for Gary like at all, but this is a guy who was traditionally print reporter, not a broadcast guy like at all. We coached him through kind of like vocal delivery, and I just think that he is such an awesome, vital, important part of telling the story.
Oh yeah, I think he did a great. I didn't know that. I didn't know he had no mic experience. He sounded great.
Oh, well, yeah, man, he's great. I mean, like, and also totally flexible with like all of the crazy things that I put him through in terms of like the things that I made him read on scripts and whatnot. But something that I definitely learned, well, so much of what I learned from this project came just straight from working like with him, and having a co-host in that way was like it was really great for me.
That's amazing. That's it is an amazing thing that I think you guys have put together, and you guys didn't, you didn't do a partial effort here, with all those different venues and all the different things. I mean, even just the story selection itself was such a big task, and I think you guys pulled it off amazingly. So the next question is, and I know you guys have got this a million times, future plans. Are we going to see occasional update episodes? Are you guys going to regroup for a completely different story, or where are we at? What can you share at this point?
I can't share a whole lot, but I can say that right now, if any updates come up, we will of course update the podcast. And if anything happens, if anything comes up, any news,
right?
We don't have any right now, which is why we haven't done that. We haven't revisited it. So, but that door is always open. In the meantime, I've completely moved on, and I'm covering a totally different beat right now. So I don't know if I'll return to like this kind of true crime genre or investigate another case. I know that Gary is getting pitched like crazy because there are so many people who have so many interesting stories to tell in this area.
Right.
So again, can't speak for him, but I know that right now we're both kind of like focusing on getting a little bit back into the grind of like the day to day. So can't say much more.
Of course, the website, links to all the stuff that I'm going to ask you for here in just a minute will be on the show notes. So I will be keeping tabs, that's for sure. I had obviously subscribed and listened to the show, had not followed either you or Gary yet on Twitter. Took care of that today. So I will make sure to keep my eyes peeled for anything future. I hope so. And I know, day jobs, real life, other things can always take hold. But I would love for the two of you to work again, regardless of the topic or subject. I think that you guys did something amazing with this show, and I'd love to see you guys partner again on whatever another digital first production might be.
Thank you so much for saying that. I mean, like, I totally would too. I just feel like we have like this odd couple, like buddy cop vibe, and I love it. So yeah, of course, I'd love to work with him again in the future. It's
literally odd couple because you guys, like you were describing earlier, you just run down the check box, right? You guys totally are coming from different universes, but it's the way it came together. It's like chocolate and peanut butter. It just worked together so well, and I think I think the end product speaks for itself.
Well, thank you.
So before we go, Veronica, please take as much time as you like. Tell everybody where they can find this awesome show we've been talking about, where they can follow you on social media, and anything else you want to tell people about.
Sure. Okay, so Finding Tammy Jo is available on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play. You can also go to the website, which we were talking about before. It's findingtammyjo.com. J is spelled J-O. And Tammy is Tammy. Went backwards on that one. Yeah, so there you can find all the links to all of the SoundCloud files, but also we have videos, we have materials from the case, and it's just like a really beautiful website. We had a fantastic photographer, Max Schulte, who took gorgeous photos of like the crime scene that are all really great. You can follow me on Twitter. I'm at Veronica WXXI. Gary is at GCraig1. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, you can also follow our respective organizations. There's WXXInews.org and there's democratandchronicle.com. And yeah, I don't know. Dan, I did want to tell you though, like, happy 2-year anniversary.
Oh, thank you. Yes, that was just this week, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, 2 years. September 1st, 2014 was, but nobody go back and listen to those first 18 episodes or so. They were all me trying to figure out what in the world I was doing. But thank you, Veronica. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Can I ask you a question?
Sure. That's what you do, right? You're a reporter.
Something like that. So what inspired like the change in the format on your show?
Oh, I got sick of hearing my own voice. So my first 18 episodes were just me talking by myself for 18 to 20 minutes or so, recommending 2 shows and end episode. That was it. And I quickly realized that I wasn't even enjoying it that much in terms of finding it that entertaining. And so eventually I said, I think what I want to do is talk to somebody who makes the show and feature their show through that conversation. And then, that was the evolution. And now my sort of catch line that I tell people all the time, what I try to do is, and I was saying this all in Chicago at Podcast Movement when I was trying to elevator pitch my show, which is I try to provide the director's commentary a la a DVD to podcasts, right? Because if you're a big fan of a movie, you might sit there and watch the movie with the director's commentary on. That's sort of what I try to do with this show.
That is such a good elevator pitch.
Yeah, that's what I try. So.
I'm totally sold.
Well, I appreciate you listening, and I appreciate everyone who has listened over these last 2 years, because it's been a heck of a ride, and I know I've blown up a lot of people's subscription lists in the process. So, well, thank you again, Veronica. I really appreciate your time, and folks, all those links that Veronica had mentioned to the Twitter accounts, the organizations, the show, and everything will be in the show notes. And this is the first time, I think, in all these 2 years that I'm actually going to say, if you have that ability, flip open the laptop and check out the website. Listen to those SoundCloud files right on the website, because that's what I did today. And it allowed me to kind of flip through the pictures as I was listening. And then when the episode ended, then I watched the videos that were embedded. And a cool way to do it with a lot of great stuff, just as Veronica described. So, folks, that will do it. Episode 106 for the Podcast Digest. Come back again next week. Another great interview in conversation with another great show or two that you should be checking out. Until then, my name is Dan Lizette for the Podcast Digest.
Thank you for listening to the Podcast Digest. You can follow the show on Twitter at PodDigest. Like the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Podcast Digest. Email the show feedback at thepodcastdigest@gmail.com. And you can find all the previous episodes and exclusive blog entries at the show's website, thepodcastdigest.info.